Good evening, night creatures. Tonight, we listen to the story of the next primordial deity, Gaia. Enjoy your time here and appreciate the earth we exist on. The living ground. Prologue. What was there before the story? Every story requires ground to stand on. Not metaphorical ground. Not the ground of premise or the ground of shared understanding, though those too are necessary. Literal ground. The thing beneath the feet of the characters, beneath the events of the narrative, beneath the very act of telling itself. The thing that holds everything up. This ground is so fundamental that it is almost always invisible. Stories do not begin with the ground. They begin with the characters who stand on it, the events that unfold across it, the conflicts that are fought over it. The ground itself is assumed. The ground is taken as given. The ground is what you stand on in order to tell the story. Gaia is the ground. Not a god who governs the earth from above. Not a divine being who is associated with the earth's qualities, not a personification of the earth as a concept. Gaia is the earth, is the literal, material, actual earth, understood as a divine being. The ground under every story ever told, the substance from which every character ever made emerged, the surface on which every event ever described occurred. This makes her story the hardest story to tell, because you are telling it while standing on her. Every word written about her is written on a surface she provides. Every thought about her is thought in a skull that is made of minerals she produced. Every mythology that attempts to describe her origin or her nature is a mythology constructed by beings who are, in the most literal sense possible, her children. The perspective problem is total. There is no outside position from which to view Gaia. There is no neutral ground from which to describe the ground, because all ground is her ground. The human attempt to understand Gaia is always the attempt of something she produced to understand the thing that produced it, is always partial, always limited by the fact of being inside rather than outside, always shaped by the conditions she provides, and therefore unable to fully see the conditions themselves. This is not an excuse for not trying. It is the context within which the trying happens. Every description of Gaia is a description from within Gaia, told by something she made, using language that developed on her surface, about the thing that made the development possible. This is the most honest beginning available. She is what you are standing on. She is what you are made of. She is the condition of your existence, the ground of your ground, the earth beneath every metaphor of earth. She is Gaia. And she was there before the story, and she will be there after the story. And she is what the story is told on, is told through, is told in. She is the ground we walk on. The first earth. Part 1. The Emergence. Chapter 1. From Chaos. She came from chaos. This is the oldest account, Hesiod's account, the account that the Greek tradition settled into as its founding cosmological narrative. From the original undifferentiated state, the gap, the void, the condition that was before conditions, she emerged. The emergence was not creation in the later theological sense. She was not made. She was not crafted by an external intelligence or shaped by a divine intention that preceded her. She emerged the way things emerge from the potential that contains them, as the first great actualization of what the primordial had been the potential for. What was she the actualization of? The specific, the determined, the massive, the stable. Chaos was the undifferentiated, the state that was everything as potential and nothing as actual. The emergence of Gaia was the emergence of the first great actual, the first thing that was emphatically, massively, permanently this rather than potentially anything. The first enormous commitment of the primordial to a specific form. She was the first specificity, the first great this. The planet, the ground, the solid surface that distinguished itself from the void by being unmistakably heavily, with the full weight of the geological, there. The emergence was gradual in the cosmic sense and instantaneous in the narrative sense. Both are true. In the actual history of the universe, the formation of the Earth was a process of billions of years. The accretion of matter around a gravitational center. The differentiation of the molten mass into core and mantle and crust. The cooling and the outgassing, and the eventual appearance of the surface that would become the ground for everything that followed. In the mythological narrative, she simply was, emerged from chaos into the condition of being there, massive and specific and real. She was there. Before the mountains had their current form, before the oceans had filled their basins, before the atmosphere had its current composition, before all the subsequent differentiations that would make the Earth the specific planet it would become. She was there. The ground was there. The Earth was there. She was Gaia. She was the ground. She was what had come from the void and committed to being this vast, specific, solid thing. She held everything that would come after. Chapter 2. The quality of her being. What was it to be Gaia? What was the experience? If experience is the right word, and it may not be, for a being whose consciousness was not the consciousness of any creature, she would eventually produce but something vaster and more diffuse. Of being the Earth. The question resists easy answers. The philosophers who came later, and the scientists who came much later, described her from the outside as the planet, as the biosphere, as the living system. They described what she did, and what she contained, and what she was the condition of. They described her effects, and her structure, and her processes. The mythology tried to describe her from a different angle, from the inside, or from as close to the inside as the mythological imagination could reach. And what the mythology reached for was not a description of the planet's geology or chemistry, but a description of the quality of a being who was the ground of everything. She was old. Not old in the sense of having lived many years. Years were a measure of time that required the sun and the moon and the regularities they produced, and she predated those regularities, or was simultaneous with them. But old in the sense of deep time, of the time that the rocks encoded, of the time that was so vast that human imagination could not hold it whole, and had to approach it in fragments, in the specific evidence of specific stones. She was patient in the way that only the geological was patient, the patience of the mountain that is worn by rain over millions of years. the patience of the continent that drifts across the surface at the speed of fingernail growth, the patience of the sediment that accumulates and compresses and becomes stone. This patience was not a quality she chose or cultivated. It was the quality of her being, the quality of the process that she was. She was teeming. This is the word that is closest to the quality of the living earth, teeming. She was not still, not inert, not the passive stage on which the action happened. She was alive, literally alive. Alive in the sense that a biogenesis produced life from her chemistry, and life evolved on and through her body, and the whole extraordinary proliferation of the biological was her proliferation, was her life expressed in the form of the living things she produced. She was complex beyond any description. The complexity of the living earth, the interlocking systems of geology and chemistry and biology and hydrology and atmosphere, was a complexity that exceeded any mind she produced the capacity to fully comprehend. She was, in this sense, always beyond the understanding of anything she had made. Her children could describe her aspects, could map her surfaces, could understand her processes in specific and useful ways. But the whole of her exceeded any specific understanding. This excess, the way she always exceeded what her children could say about her, was the most accurate measure of her divinity. Chapter 3. Before the children. She existed before she produced anything. This period, the period before the mountains had taken their current forms, before the oceans had filled, before the first living things had emerged from her chemistry, was the longest period of her existence, and the one least accessible to any mythology. What was she then? What was the earth before it became what we know as the earth? The scientific account is vivid in its way. A molten sphere, its surface convulsing with volcanic activity, its atmosphere thick with gases that would be poisonous to the life that would eventually breathe here. A world of fire and acid and the extreme conditions of the early formation. A world that bore almost no resemblance to the world that would eventually support the life that would eventually tell stories about it. And yet she was already Gaia. The molten surface was her surface. The poisonous atmosphere was her atmosphere. The extreme conditions were her conditions. She was the earth in the form the earth had then, before the cooling and the condensation, and the first rains and the first oceans, and the extraordinary transition that would eventually make the surface capable of sustaining life. She was patient through all of this, not patient in the sense of waiting for something better. She was not waiting, was not oriented toward a future state she was moving toward. She was simply being what she was, in the form she currently had, in the time that was the current time. The mythology could not reach this period. The mythology worked with the recognizable earth, the earth of mountains and rivers and seas and soil, the earth that could support the divine beings and their divine dramas, the earth that was the stage for the stories the mythology needed to tell. The earth before recognizability was not available to the mythological imagination. But she was there. She was there in the molten early time, and she was there in the cooling, and she was there in the first rains, and she was there in the filling of the first ocean basins. She was always there. She was the there. The mythology began its story of her with the emergence from chaos, and then jumped to the earth as a place capable of supporting divine beings and mortal ones. Between the emergence and the habitable earth was the long geological time, the time of the cooling and the forming, and the first simple chemistry of life. This time was hers. This time was her early life. It is not forgotten simply because it is not told. Chapter 4. The First Children. From herself she produced, first and without a partner, Uranos, the sky, the heavens, the vault above the earth that was her complement and her eventual consort, and the source of the most significant pain she would endure. This self-production was the mythology's way of expressing something that the geological account expressed differently, that the atmosphere and the sky emerged from the earth, were produced by the earth's own chemistry, were not external to the earth, but were the earth's self-expression into the domain above its surface. The sky was the earth's child. The atmosphere was what the earth made. Uranos was Gaia's production. She also produced, from herself and without a partner, Pontus, the sea, the oceans that covered so much of her surface, that filled the basins her geology had shaped, that were the medium in which the first life would emerge, and in which so much of the subsequent life would continue. The sea was hers. It was her child and her domain, and in some sense more her than the dry land, the water that covered her, that moved on her surface. That was the condition of the life she would produce. She produced the mountains, Aurea, the mountain spirits, from herself. The mountains were the most visible expression of her geological activity, the most dramatic evidence of the forces that moved within her. The mountains were her children, in the sense that they were produced by her own internal dynamics, thrust up by the same forces that moved the plates of her crust. These first productions were not narrative events, were not the births of divine beings who would then have their own stories and their own agency and their own relationships with the other divine beings. They were the productions of a being who was producing herself into her various expressions, who was differentiating herself into the sky and the sea and the mountains that were the features of the known world. She was making the world. The world-making was her self-expression. This was the beginning of the story that would eventually become the mythology we know. The story that would include the Titans and the Olympians and the heroes and the whole extraordinary drama of the Greek divine world. But at this stage, the story was not yet that story. At this stage, it was the story of the earth becoming the earth, of Gaia producing the sky and the sea and the mountains, and becoming the specific, vivid, life-supporting planet that the mythology required as its stage. She was making the stage. She was the stage. She was the making and the made. Part 2. The Marriage and its Consequences. Chapter 5. Uranos. Uranos looked down on her, and she looked up at him, and between them there was the world, the specific world, the world of the sky above and the earth below, the world that was defined by this great vertical axis, from the ground to the vault of heaven. The mythology understood their relationship as a marriage, which was the human framework most adequate to the cosmological relationship between the sky and the earth. The sky and the earth were in relation, were in the most intimate possible relation. the relation of the thing that covered and the thing that was covered, of the rain that fell from the sky and the earth that received the rain, of the light that came from above and the surface that was illuminated by it. This intimacy was the intimacy of the largest possible things. It was not the intimacy of two individuals who came together by choice in the social context that made individual choice meaningful. It was the intimacy of the cosmic, the relation between the sky and the earth that was the given condition of the world, the relation without which neither had its full character, the relation that was so fundamental it predated any concept of choice. She received him. The mythology described their union as the origin of the first great divine generation. The Titans, who would be the divine beings of the age before the Olympians, the vast and powerful divine forces that governed the world in the time before the current divine order. She bore the Titans from this union, 12 of them, 6 male and 6 female, the enormous divine beings who were named for their vastness, for the stretching quality that the word Titan implied. Oceanus and Tethys, Hyperion and Thea, Cous and Phoebe, Cronus and Rhea, Cryos and Mnemosyne, Iapetus and Thamis. These were her children, the first children of the union of the sky and the earth, the first generation of the divine beings who would populate the cosmos, the beings from whom everything else in the Greek divine genealogy eventually descended. She bore them with the quality of the deep earth's productivity, not easily, not without cost, but with the inexhaustible capacity that was her characteristic. She produced life. She had always produced life. These were the largest forms of that production. The divine generation, the Titans who were themselves forces of nature, whose names and domains express the fundamental qualities of the world. She loved them. This too is in the mythology, and it is the thing that made what followed what it was. She loved them. The mother's love for the children she had produced. Specific, total. The love that would eventually be the source of the catastrophe that the mythology of Gaia's middle period was built on. Chapter 6. The Cyclopes and the 100-handed. She bore also the Cyclopes, 3 of them, the giants with the single eye, the beings who would become the forge workers of the divine world, who would eventually make the thunderbolts that Zeus would wield. Brontes and Steropes and Arges, thunder and lightning and brightness, divine craftsmen of the most primordial kind. And she bore the Hecatoncheires, the 100-handed, 3 beings of such enormous power that they had no equivalent in the subsequent mythology. Cottus, Briareos, Gyges, each with 50 heads and 100 hands, beings of vast and terrible strength, beings that the mythology struggled to describe because their enormity exceeded the categories available for description. She bore all of these. She bore them from her union with Uranos, and she bore them with the same capacity she brought to everything, the capacity of the earth for the inexhaustible production of forms. And Uranos feared them. He feared the Cyclopes and the 100-handed most, feared them with the specific fear of the powerful being who recognizes in its offspring a power that might exceed its own. He looked at what she had produced, and he saw, in the largest and most powerful of her children, the potential threat to his own dominance. He pushed them back. He pushed them back into the earth, into Gaia, into her body, back into the depths from which they had come. He refused to let them emerge into the world. He kept them confined within her, unborn in the meaningful sense, present but unreleased. This was the first great injury, the first pain that the mythology recorded her as feeling, not an abstraction, not a philosophical suffering, but the specific, physical, genuine pain of a mother whose children were being forced back into her body, confined within her when she was trying to release them into the world. She held this pain. She held the children within her, the Cyclopes and the 100-handed, confined in the depths of her earth. And she held the pain of the confinement, and she thought about what to do. This thinking, the long, slow, geological thinking of the being, whose thought was not the quick calculation of the human mind, but the patient planning of something that could wait as long as it needed to wait. This thinking produced the plan that would end Uranos's dominance and begin the next age of the world. Chapter 7. The Plan and the Sickle. She made the sickle from the grey flint that was her own substance. This detail matters. She made the instrument of the change from herself, from her own material, from the stone that was her body. The means of the transformation was hers. The agency was hers. The plan was hers. She brought the Titans together, the 12 great divine children who had been released into the world. And she told them what was happening. She described the confinement of their siblings, the pain she was holding, the injustice of what Uranos had done. She asked them to help. They were afraid. They were powerful, these Titans, vast and divine, and the governing forces of the world they inhabited. But they were afraid of their father, of the sky that covered everything, of the omnipresence of Uranos who was above and who saw. Cronus was not afraid, or was afraid and acted anyway, which is the more meaningful form of the fearless act. The act performed in the knowledge of the risk, not in the ignorance of it. He took the sickle she had made. He hid in the place where she had arranged for him to hide. When Uranos came to her, as the sky always came to the earth, in the rain, in the covering, in the intimacy of the sky's relation to the ground, Cronus acted. He castrated Uranos. He cut away the sky's reproductive power and threw what he had cut into the sea, and from the sea foam around the divine blood and the divine substance came Aphrodite, love, desire, the force of attraction born from the wound, and the drops of blood that fell on the earth, on Gaia, on her surface, produced the Erinyes and the giants and other beings, born from the wounding, born from her reception of what the sky's suffering gave her. She received the consequences of the plan she had made. She received the Erinyes, the forces of righteous vengeance, the beings whose function was the enforcement of the deepest moral order, born from her ground where Uranos's blood had fallen. She received this as what it was, the consequence of the act of justice she had arranged, the new life that the violent righting of a wrong produced. Uranos was severed. The sky drew back from the earth. The intimacy of the primal union was over, replaced by the distance between the sky above and the earth below that would characterize the world from then on. The sky was still there, still above, still in relation to the earth. The rain still fell, the sun still shone, The relationship persisted. But the closeness, the covering, the total intimacy of the first union was over. She had made this happen. She had planned the ending of the first divine union because the ending was necessary, because what Uranos was doing to her, to the children she was trying to release, was unjust and was damaging and had to stop. She made it stop. This was the first time the mythology showed her as an agent. Not only the ground, not only the producer, not only the mother who bore what the union made, but the planner, the actor, the being who assessed the situation and decided what needed to happen and arranged for it to happen. She was not only the ground, she was the one who acted from the ground. She was the earth that moved. Part 3. The Second Generation. Chapter 8. The Age of the Titans. The Titans governed. With Uranos withdrawn, with the sky no longer dominating the earth in the way it had, the Titans took up the governance of the world, the 12 great children of the sky and the earth, ruling the cosmos in the age before the Olympians. She watched this governance from her position, the ground beneath everything, the mother of the governing generation, the earth on which the Titan age played out. She was not absent from this age. She was its literal foundation, as she was the foundation of every age. But she was not its active manager. The Titans ruled, and she provided the earth they ruled on. And the relationship between her and this generation was the relationship between the mother and the adult children, who had taken up their own governance of their own domains. She watched Cronus rule. Cronus, who'd been brave enough to do what she had needed done, who had taken the sickle and acted. Cronus became the ruler of the Titans, became the king of the age, became the father who would repeat, in modified form, the pattern of his own father's fear and confinement. He swallowed his children. When the oracle, when she, Gaia, or the tradition of divine prophecy, told him that his own child would overthrow him, as he had overthrown his father, he responded with the preemptive swallowing. He took each child that Rhea bore and swallowed it, keeping it inside him, preventing the possibility of the succession he feared. He was doing, in a different way, what Uranos had done, refusing to release the children who had come from the generation after him, keeping them confined, preventing their emergence into the world. She saw this pattern. She saw her son repeating her son's injury of her. She saw the pattern that the mythology encoded in this generational repetition. The powerful being who fears the succession, who responds to the fear by confining the next generation, who creates exactly the conditions that make the overthrow inevitable, because the confinement produces the rage that produces the overthrower. She intervened again. When Rhea came to her, desperate and grief-stricken, and looking for a way to save the child she was about to bear, the child who would be Zeus, she told Rhea what to do. She arranged the substitution, the stone wrapped in swaddling that Cronus would swallow instead of the child. The real child hidden and raised in safety until he was ready. She arranged the salvation of Zeus. She was the one who told Rhea where to hide him, who prepared the conditions for his survival, who understood what the situation required and provided what the situation required. She was the planner again, the patient geological patience of the deep earth, making the long plan that would eventually produce the next change in the world's divine order. Chapter 9. The Prophecy Function. She gave prophecy. This is one of the aspects of her mythology that is least often foregrounded, and that is among the most significant. Before Delphi became Apollo's oracle, before the oracle system of the Greek world had taken the form it eventually took, the prophetic voice was hers. She was the source of the earth's knowledge, of the deep knowledge that the earth itself encoded, the knowledge of the long past and the long future that was available to the being who had been there for all of it, and who was continuous with the substrate that recorded everything. The rocks remembered. The deep strata encoded the history of the world. She was the being who was identified with all of this recording, who was the record itself. The oracle at Delphi was first hers. Before Apollo slew Python and claimed the oracle for the Olympian order, the sacred site at Delphi was a site of earth prophecy, the ground speaking through the fissure, the vapors rising from the earth, carrying the knowledge of the deep places. This earth prophecy was her prophecy. It was the prophetic function of the being who was the substrate of everything, who encoded in herself the history of everything that had happened, and who therefore could, in the ways that the deep pattern knowledge of the vast and long-lived made possible, speak to the shape of what was coming. She gave this prophecy freely. She told Uranos what would happen, that his children would overthrow him. She told Cronus what would happen, that his child would overthrow him. She told Rhea how to save Zeus. She told Zeus what the war against the Titans would require, what allies he needed, what the conditions of victory were. She was the source of the divine knowledge that guided the governance of each divine age, not the source of all knowledge. She was not omniscient in the later theological sense, not the all-knowing God of the monotheistic traditions. She was the source of the deep earth knowledge, the knowledge of the pattern, the knowledge of what had happened and what the pattern suggested about what was coming. This knowledge was genuine and was valuable, and was the resource that each new generation of the divine turned to when the situation exceeded what their own understanding could manage. She was the oracle. She was the deep voice. She was the earth speaking its own knowledge about the shape of what was. Chapter 10. The Titanomachy. The war between the Titans and the Olympians, the Titanomachy, the great cosmic battle that established the current divine order, was fought on her surface. This is a simple geographical fact that had profound implications. She held the war. She was the ground on which the mountains were thrown, and the ground that absorbed the impacts when they landed. She was the surface across which the armies of the divine engaged. She was what was shaken when the earth shook, what was disturbed when the disturbance went down to the roots of the mountains, what was disrupted when the divine violence reached the level of the geological. She had told Zeus what he needed, that to win the war against the Titans, he needed the allies that Cronus had confined in Tartarus, the Cyclopes and the Hundred-Handed, the beings that Uranos had first imprisoned and that Cronus had kept imprisoned. She told Zeus to free them. She told him that their power was what the war required. She arranged again the release of the confined. The beings held inside, held in the depths, held against the will of the mother who had produced them. She arranged their release, this time through the agency of Zeus, rather than through the agency of Cronus. The Cyclopes were freed, and they gave Zeus the thunderbolt. The 100-handed were freed, and they threw the mountains and the boulders that turned the tide of the war. The beings that had been confined in the earth were released, were given their freedom, were allowed to be in the world. She received this. She had wanted this since the beginning, had wanted the release of the confined children from the time that Uranos had first pushed them back. The release, when it finally came, was the completion of the desire she had held through the entire Titan age. But the Titanomachy also hurt her. The war was fought on her body. The violence was done to her surface. The mountains thrown, and the seas boiled, and the earth shook. All of this was done to her, was suffered by her, was the cost of the cosmic transition from one divine order to the next. She held this pain as she had held every other pain, with the patience of the geological, the endurance of the being who was the ground of everything, and who could not remove herself from the events that played out on her surface. She could not escape. She was the ground. The ground held what was placed on it, suffered what was done to it, endured what the events of the world required her to endure. She endured. She always endured. Chapter 11. After the War. The Titans were confined in Tartarus. The Olympians took the governance of the world. Zeus became the king of the gods, the ruler of the sky, the authority of the current divine order. She was the ground under all of this. She was the ground under the Olympian age, as she had been the ground under the Titan age, as she had been the ground under the time before the Titans, as she would be the ground under whatever came after the Olympians. She had helped make the Olympian age possible. She had told Rhea how to save Zeus. She had told Zeus what he needed to win the war. She had arranged the release of the Cyclopes and the 100-handed. She had been at every crucial moment of the transition from the Titan age to the Olympian age, the source of the knowledge and the arrangement that made the transition happen. She was the mother of the age that had been overthrown, and the grandmother of the age that had done the overthrowing. Both were hers. Both were her children, in the extended sense of the divine genealogy that traced everything back to her union with Uranos. She did not grieve only for the Titans or only for the Olympians. She held the whole. The transition, the violence, the loss and the establishment, the confined Titans in Tartarus, and the established Olympians in their various domains. She held all of it with the patience and the comprehensiveness of the being who was the ground of everything, and who therefore had no position of preference among the things that stood on her. She was larger than any side. She was the ground under both sides. She was what remained when the war was over, and the new order was established. Still there, still the earth, still the ground that the new order stood on, as the old order had stood on her. This was not resignation. This was the condition of being what she was. The ground endures what is placed on it. The earth persists through the changes that play out on its surface. She was the persistence. She was the endurance. She was the thing that was still there. The mother of all. Part 4. The Children. Chapter 12. What she produced. The list of what she produced is the list of the world. This is not hyperbole. She is the earth, and the earth produced the life that populated it, and the life that populated it is the world in the sense that matters for the experience of being alive in it. She produced the first life. Not in the narrative sense of the mythology. The mythology was not equipped to tell the story of a biogenesis, of the first replicating molecules in the early ocean, of the long evolution from the first cells to the complex life that eventually produced the beings who would tell mythology. But in the factual sense, the earth is where life came from, and Gaia is the earth, and therefore all life is hers. The trees are hers. The first photosynthetic organisms that transformed the early atmosphere, that filled the air with oxygen over the long geological time, that made the atmosphere that complex life would require. These were hers. The green things, in all their forms, and across all the time that green things have been growing on her surface. These are hers. The root that splits the rock and the canopy, that captures the light, and the seed that contains the next generation. All hers. The animals are hers. From the first multicellular organisms in the ancient ocean, to the first complex animals with nervous systems, to the first creatures that moved onto the land. All hers. The fish and the amphibians and the reptiles and the birds and the mammals. All expressions of her life. All children in the extended and biological sense. The humans are hers. The tradition was explicit about this. Humans were made from her substance, from the clay and the earth, from the minerals of her body. The human skeleton was her minerals. The human blood carried her iron. The human body was assembled from the elements of the earth's chemistry, would return to those elements when the body was finished being used. The mythology produced a specific tradition in which the first humans were produced directly from her. In some versions, shaped by Prometheus from earth and water. In other versions, sprung from the soil after the flood. In other versions, the descendants of the giants that her blood had produced when it received the blood of Uranus's wounding. She was the mother of all these things, not the mother in the individual sense, not the being who had specific relationships with specific beings she had produced from her body, but the mother in the elemental sense, the source, the ground, the being from whose substance all of this came, and to whose substance all of this would return. Chapter 13. The Giants and the Gigantomachy. She was not finished producing challenges to the Olympian order after the Titanomachy. She bore the giants, enormous divine beings, produced from the drops of Uranus's blood that had fallen on her surface at the moment of the castration. The giants were her response to the confinement of the Titans in Tartarus, were the beings she produced from the wound and the blood, the new generation that would carry the challenge forward. The Gigantomachy, the War of the Giants, was the second great cosmic battle, the second attempt to overthrow the Olympian order. The giants were powerful in a way that the Titans had been powerful, with the enormous geological earthly power of the beings who had come from her directly, who had her substance in their composition. She guided them, she gave them counsel, gave them the knowledge of what they needed to challenge the Olympians, gave them the allies and the weapons they required. She was, in the gigantomachy, on the giant's side. On the side of the beings she had produced, against the Olympian order that had confined her earlier children. The Olympians won with the help of Heracles, the mortal hero whose participation was essential, because the prophecy was that the giants could only be defeated with the assistance of a mortal. She knew this prophecy. She was the source of prophecies. She had tried, as the war progressed, to find the herb that would protect the giants from the mortal weapon, had tried to find the counter to the condition the prophecy required. Zeus prevented her from finding it. He ordered the darkness to prevent the sun from rising, ordered Eos and Selene and Helios to hold back their light, so that she could not find the herb in the dark. The giants fell. The Olympian order was re-established. She was defeated again, not destroyed. She was the earth. She couldn't be destroyed in the way that mortals and even gods could be destroyed. But her challenge to the Olympian order was defeated, and her children were defeated. And the order that had confined her earlier children remained in place. She bore this with the endurance she brought to everything. She was the ground. The ground received the fallen giants and held them. They were, in the tradition, buried under the earth, under volcanoes that expressed their continuing power in the only form available to the imprisoned. She held them. She was their prison, as she had been the prison of the Cyclopes and the 100-handed before them. She was the prison of her own children again. This was the recurring tragedy of her story. Chapter 14. Typhon. She bore Typhon last and most terrible, the most extreme of all the challenges to the Olympian order, the monster that came closest to actually overthrowing Zeus. Typhon was hers, born from her in her grief and her rage at the defeat of the giants. He was enormous. The mythology described him in terms that exceeded any other description in the Greek tradition. Serpentine lower body, 100 dragon heads, a voice that combined the sounds of every animal, fire in his eyes, divine fire that he could throw with the force that threatened even Olympus. He was the sum of the earth's capacity for the extreme, for the violent, for the power that was geological rather than divine in the Olympian sense. She bore him in rage. The mythology was specific about this. The gigantomachy had ended in the defeat of the giants, and she was angry, and her anger produced Typhon, the anger of the earth, the most violent form of the geological, the eruption and the earthquake, and the tectonic violence that was the earth in its most terrifying expression. This anger was Typhon. He nearly won. Zeus himself was temporarily overwhelmed by Typhon, had his sinews cut, was briefly incapacitated, was rescued by Hermes and Pan, and eventually recovered, and returned to the battle with his full thunder. The battle of Zeus and Typhon was the most serious threat the current divine order had ever faced, more serious than the Titanomachy, more serious than the Gigantomachy. Typhon was the Earth's final answer, the ultimate expression of her anger, the most extreme form of the challenge she could produce. Zeus won. He buried Typhon under Mount Etna, under her, under the volcano that would express Typhon's ongoing power in the only form available to the imprisoned. The earth shook with his struggles. The volcano erupted with his fire. She held him, as she held everything, as the ground holds everything, that is placed in it. After Typhon, the challenges ended. She accepted, not from defeat in the deepest sense, not from having given up the love for her confined children, or the anger at the order that had confined them, but from the accumulated evidence that the challenges were not producing the release she sought, that the wars were not resolving in the liberation of the Titans and the Giants, that the Olympian order had established itself in a way that her direct challenges could not overturn. She turned to other forms of influence, quieter forms, the long, patient, geological forms that were more natural to her nature than the wars had been. Chapter 15. The weight she held. She held everything. This is the plain fact of her divine function, and it deserves direct statement. She held everything. She held the weight of the divine beings who lived on her. The Olympians in their various domains, the Titans in their Tartarus confinement, the Giants in their various imprisonments, the satyrs and the nymphs, and the half-divine beings who populated the spaces between the fully divine and the fully mortal. She held them all. She held the weight of the mortal world, the millions and then the billions of mortal lives that played out on her surface, that built their cities on her, and buried their dead in her, and drew their sustenance from her, and returned to her when they were finished with the mortal project. She held the weight of the dead. The dead went into her, were buried in her, were the earth's claim on the mortal body that the mortal had borrowed for the duration of a life. She received the dead as she received everything, without selection, without judgment in the preliminary sense, with the comprehensive acceptance of the ground that receives what falls on it. She held the weight of the growing things, the forests and the grasslands, and the wetlands and the deserts, the entire living surface of herself, the extraordinary proliferation of the biological that she had been producing for billions of years, and that she continued to produce and sustain. She held the weight of the geological processes that moved within her, the tectonic activity, the volcanic expression, the circulation of materials through the geological cycle that was the long breathing of the Earth's interior. She held these within herself as the processes of her own body, the circulation that kept her living in the way appropriate to what she was. She held all of this simultaneously, continuously, without pause. This was the nature of being what she was. The ground does not get to rest from holding. The earth does not get to stop being the earth. She held because holding was what she was. This was the most fundamental thing about her. Not the productions, not the prophecies, not the wars and their consequences. The holding, the patient, continuous, inexhaustible holding of everything that existed on her surface and within her body. She held the living earth. Part 5. What she was within the world. Chapter 16. The body of the earth. She was the earth's body, not metaphorically, not as a way of saying that the earth was somehow like a body. She was the body of the earth in the sense that her body was the earth, that the geological structure of the planet was her physical form, that the processes of the planet were her physiological processes. The tectonic plates were her skin moving, The volcanoes were her breath and her fire. The earthquakes were her shudders, the seismic expression of the forces moving within her body. The rivers were her circulation, carrying the water from the high places to the low, returning it eventually to the ocean, and from the ocean to the clouds, and from the clouds to the high places again. The water cycle was her circulatory system. The soil was her flesh in the most literal sense. The biological and mineral complexity of the soil was the active surface of her body, the place where her biological and geological processes met, the interface between the geological and the living. The soil was where she was most herself in the integrated sense, geological material transformed by biological activity into the complex living medium that made the surface life possible. The ocean was her blood, in the most ancient mythological sense, and in the functional biological sense, the medium in which the first life had emerged, and in which the ongoing life of the marine world lived, the thermal regulator that kept the surface habitable, the chemical recycler that maintained the balance of the atmosphere. The atmosphere was her breath, the gases she had produced and maintained over the geological time, the chemical balance she had established and continued to maintain through the biological processes that were her ongoing physiology. The oxygen in the atmosphere was biological, was the product of photosynthetic life, was the waste product of the organisms that had been transforming sunlight and carbon dioxide into organic material for billions of years. The atmosphere was the product of her biology. She breathed, she circulated, she processed, she maintained. These were not metaphors. They were the functional descriptions of what the living planet did, expressed in the language of the body, because the body was the most accurate available metaphor for the integrated, self-regulating, living system that the Earth was and that she was. She was a body, the largest body, the body that all the other bodies lived on and within. Chapter 17. The Oracles of Earth. She spoke through the earth. This is the understanding that the Greek oracle tradition preserved most clearly, that the prophetic voice was the earth's voice, that the oracle sites were the places where the earth's knowledge rose to the surface, that the fissures in the rock and the vapors that rose from them were the breath of the earth carrying the earth's speech. Delphi was the most famous of these sites, and Delphi's history was the history of the oracle passing from one divine custodian to another, from Gaia to Themis, to Phoebe to Apollo, while remaining essentially what it had been from the beginning, a place where the earth spoke. The Pythia who sat above the fissure at Delphi, breathing the vapors that rose from the earth, speaking in the God-touched state that the vapors induced. She was the instrument of the earth's speech in the most literal possible way. She breathed the earth's breath. She spoke with the earth's knowledge. She was the medium through which the prophetic understanding of the deep substrate rose to the surface, where it could be received. The oracles knew the pattern. They knew the long view, the view that was available to the being who had been present for everything, and whose substance recorded everything. They spoke to the questions of the moment from the position of the pattern knower, the one who understood the shape of things across the time scale that exceeded any individual life or any civilization's span. This was Gaia's knowledge made accessible through the oracle. Not magic, not the supernatural intervention of a divine being in the affairs of mortals. The expression of the deep knowledge of the old substrate, the geological patience, speaking to the human urgency of the particular moment. She spoke through the earth. The earth had always been speaking. The oracle was the place where the earth's speech became audible to the beings who needed to hear it. Chapter 18. The Oaths. She was invoked in the most serious oaths. When the Greeks wanted to swear an oath that could not be broken, that was binding in the most absolute sense, that called on the deepest possible authority, they swore by Gaia. To swear by Gaia was to swear by the ground under everything. To invoke her as witness was to invoke the oldest possible witness, the being who had been there for everything, who had recorded everything, who held the pattern of everything in her geological memory. To make her the guarantor of a promise was to make the earth itself the guarantor, the most permanent and comprehensive available. The gods swore by her. When the divine oath was most serious, most binding, most in need of the authority that exceeded any individual divine being's authority, the oath was sworn by Gaia and by the Styx, the two oldest and most comprehensive witnesses available. Gaia as the earth, the ground, the source. The Styx as the boundary water, the oldest water, the water that preceded the organization of the cosmos into its current form. The oath sworn by Gaia was the oath that the earth held. The earth was the witness. The earth was the recorder. The earth was the being that knew whether the oath had been kept or broken, that held the account of what had been promised and what had been done. This was another expression of the oracle function, of the earth as the record keeper, the memory of the world, the archive of everything that had happened. The oath sworn before Gaia was the oath held in the earth's memory, held in the geological record, held in the body of the being, who was the ground under everything, and who did not forget. She did not forget. She could not forget. She was the substrate that recorded, the body that held the imprint of everything that had been placed on it. The oath was recorded in her. The keeping or the breaking was recorded in her. The consequence that the breaking produced was hers to know and hers to speak through the oracle when the speaking was required. She was the witness, the oldest witness, the most comprehensive witness. The oath sworn before her could not be hidden from her. Chapter 19. The Sacred Sites. The places where her presence was most strongly felt, where the membrane between the earth's deep knowledge and the surface world of mortal and divine experience was thinnest, were her sacred sites. Not only Delphi, the caves. The cave was the entrance into the earth's body, the place where the surface gave way to the interior, where the living world went into the rock and the dark, where the world below the surface was accessible to the world above it. The cave was her threshold, and the threshold was where her presence was most accessible. The fissures, the crack in the rock, was the earth speaking. The geological fracture that revealed the interior, the opening through which the volcanic breath rose or the subterranean water emerged. The fissure was the earth's mouth, and the mouth was where the oracle lived. The springs, the place where water came up from the earth, was sacred to her. The spring that rose from the ground was the earth's gift of the essential liquid, the groundwater brought to the surface for the use of the living world. Springs were sacred in the most practical sense. They were where life was possible in the dry landscape, where the water that the living needed was accessible. They were sacred because life depended on them, and life depended on her, and the spring was the most immediate form of her gift of the essential, the fertile places, the specific locations where the earth's productivity was most visible, the valleys and the floodplains, and the rich agricultural land where the growing was most abundant, were her sacred sites in the practical sense. The fertility cult, the tradition of honoring the earth for what it produced, was the tradition of honoring Gaia in the form of her most direct and most necessary gift, the mountains, the high places where the earth met the sky, where the geological reached its most dramatic expression, where the tectonic forces had pushed the land up into the clouds. These were sacred too, but for a different reason. The mountain was the earth at its most imposing, at its most clearly larger than human scale. The mountain expressed her magnitude. She was in all of these places, not more in some and less in others, but differently in each. The cave and the fissure and the spring, and the fertile plain and the mountain, were different expressions of the same divine reality, the same earth understood in its different modes. Part 6. The Mortal World. Chapter 20. The Mortals and the Earth. She was the mother of the mortals in the most fundamental sense, not in the narrative mythological sense of having produced them from her body in the way she had produced the Titans, but in the elemental sense that the elements of the mortal body were her elements, that the minerals of the human skeleton were her minerals, that the chemistry of the human cell was her chemistry. The mortals lived on her. They built their cities on her surface, plowed her flesh to plant their crops, dug into her body to extract the metals that became their tools and their weapons and their ornaments. They drank the water that rose from her depths and ate the food that grew from her soil and breathed the air that was the product of her biology. They were entirely dependent on her. This dependence was so fundamental that it was nearly invisible, was taken as the given condition of the mortal world, was the assumption on which everything else rested, was so completely and comprehensively the ground of mortal existence that it could not be seen from inside the mortal world, any more than a fish could see the water it swam in. She nourished them. The mythology was explicit about this. The tradition of Gaia as the nurturer, as the mother who gave food to her mortal children, was the tradition that expressed the most fundamental reality of the mortal relationship to the earth. The earth fed the mortals. The soil grew the grain. The water nourished the animals. The minerals built the bones. She fed them all, continuously, from the inexhaustible productivity of the living earth. She received them when they died. The dead went into the earth, were buried in her, were returned to the substance from which they had come. The burial practice was the ritual acknowledgement of the relationship. The mortal body had been assembled from her substance for the duration of a life, and at the end of the life, the substance was returned to her. The earth received the dead. She was the mother and the tomb simultaneously, the source and the destination, the beginning and the end. This dual quality, mother and tomb, producer and receiver, was the most complete expression of what she was in her relationship to the mortal world. She gave the substance of the mortal body, and she received it back. She was the circulation of the material world, the cycle through which the elements passed from the earth to the living, and from the living back to the earth. She was the cycle. She was what the cycle was made of. She was the mother and the tomb and the cycle itself. Chapter 21. Agriculture and her gifts. The development of agriculture was the most significant change in the mortal relationship to her that occurred within the period of the mythology. Before agriculture, the mortals were gatherers, were the beings who moved across her surface, taking what the surface offered, dependent on her spontaneous productivity, living within the limits of what the wild earth produced. With agriculture, the relationship changed. The mortals began to actively manage her productivity, to select which plants grew where, to prepare the soil for the specific plants they wanted, to irrigation and fertilization, and all the practices that turned the earth's general productivity into the specific productivity the farmers sought. This was a more intimate relationship than the gathering had been. Agriculture required knowledge of the earth, of its specific chemistry, its specific biology, its specific responses to the various interventions the farmer could make. The farmer had to know the ground in the detailed way that the gatherer did not need to know it. The farmer had to know what the earth wanted, what it responded well to, what it needed to give what was being asked of it. This knowledge was a form of relationship. The farmer and the earth were in conversation, the farmer asking the earth for specific things, and the earth responding according to its specific nature, the farmer learning the earth's responses and adjusting the asking according to what was learned. She was in this relationship. The knowledge of the earth that the farmer needed was knowledge of her specific character in the specific place, of her chemistry and her biology, and her hydrology, and all the specific qualities that made one piece of ground different from another. The farmer's knowledge was her knowledge made accessible through the practice of the long attention. Demeter was her daughter in the tradition that made Demeter the goddess of the grain and the goddess of the agricultural knowledge. Demeter carried forward what Gaia was, expressed the agricultural dimension of the earth's relationship to the mortal world in a divine form that was accessible to the mortals who depended on the grain for their survival. She was behind Demeter. She was the ground that Demeter's grain grew in. She was the earth that the agricultural relationship was the relationship to. Chapter 22. The prayers offered to the ground. They prayed to her in the specific mode that the earth required, not the prayer directed upward to the sky gods, the prayer that looked to the heavens for the divine response. The prayer to Gaia went down, went into the ground. The libation poured onto the earth was the prayer directed to her. The wine or the water or the blood that was given not to the sky, but to the earth, that went into the ground and was received by the ground. This gesture, the downward gesture, the pouring into rather than the lifting toward, was the acknowledgement of the direction of her divinity. She was below. She was the ground. The prayer went where she was. The specific prayers to her varied. The prayer for fertility, for the earth's productivity, for the crops to grow and the herds to multiply, and the children to be born healthy. The prayer for the dead, for the earth to receive the dead gently, to hold the dead well, to be the good mother to the dead as she had been the good mother to the living. The prayer before planting, the acknowledgement that what was about to be done was done on her, with her, by her permission, and through her participation. She received these prayers with the comprehensive acceptance that was her characteristic mode. She did not favor one farmer's prayer over another's, did not give the crops more to the one who prayed more elaborately. She gave what the earth gave: the productivity of her nature, the fertility of her substance, the water from her depths, and the minerals from her soil. She gave these to all who stood on her surface, regardless of the prayers they offered. The prayers were the mortal's acknowledgement. The giving was her nature. The two were related. The prayer was the acknowledgement of what she gave, the receipt of the gift with the consciousness of its being a gift. But the gift was not conditional on the acknowledgement. The earth fed everyone who stood on it, praying or not praying, acknowledging or not acknowledging. This was the quality of her generosity: unconditional. She gave because giving was what she was, because the fertility was her nature, because the support of the life that lived on her surface was her function and her reality. She was the unconditional mother, the mother who gave regardless, the ground that held regardless, the deep understanding. Part 7. What She Knew. Chapter 23. The Patience of the Geological. She knew patience in a way that no other being knew patience. Not the patience of the individual who waited for something. Not the patience of the person who had to wait a long time for what they wanted. The patience of the geological. The patience of the process that moved at the speed of continents. The patience of the time scale in which millions of years were not a long time. This patience was not passive. The geological patience was an active process, the ongoing, continuous work of the geological cycle, the circulation of materials, the weathering and the deposition, and the subduction and the uplift. The geological was always working. It was working at the pace of the tectonic, which was the pace of the extremely slow from the perspective of any individual life, but which was, from the perspective of the long time, the pace of the continuous and energetic. She worked at this pace. Her plans were geological plans, plans that played out over the time scale of the geological, plans that required the patience of the being who understood that the thing she was working toward might take longer than any mortal civilization would last, longer than any heroic age would endure, longer than any specific divine order would maintain itself. The plan that produced the salvation of Zeus from Cronus. That plan had been in preparation since Cronus swallowed his first child. The plan that produced the Titanomachy. That plan had been in preparation since Uranus had pushed the first children back into her. The geological patience was the patience of the long plan, the patience of the being who understood that the right time for a thing to happen was the time when the conditions for the thing were right, and who was willing to wait for those conditions without rushing them. This patience was one of her greatest gifts to the beings she dealt with. The mortals who came to her oracle with their urgent questions received from the earth's patience the long perspective on the urgent question, the perspective that could see the specific question in the context of the pattern, that could speak to the urgent moment from the ground of the long understanding. She was the long understanding. The patience was not separate from her. It was the condition of what she was, the quality of the being who was the geological and who therefore experienced time at the geological scale. Chapter 24. The Anger of the Earth. She was capable of anger. This is important and is less often discussed than her patience and her nurturing and her prophetic function. The anger of the earth was real, and it was specific. It was the anger of the mother whose children had been confined, the anger of the being who had asked for justice and had been refused, the anger of the source whose productions had been imprisoned rather than released. She bore the giants in anger. She bore Typhon in anger. These productions were not the calm productions of the fertile earth. They were the angry productions, the earth in its most extreme and violent form, the tectonic violence that was the earth's expression of the forces moving within it that were too large and too powerful to remain contained. The earthquake was her anger in the literal sense. The volcano was her anger. The tidal wave was her anger. These were the expressions of the forces within her that exceeded the surface's capacity to contain them. The pressure that built until it found its release in the violent expression that the surface world experienced as catastrophe. She did not moderate these expressions out of consideration for what was on her surface. The volcano did not choose to erupt at the convenient time, in the place where it would damage the fewest lives. The earthquake did not calibrate its intensity to what the built environment could survive. She expressed what needed to be expressed, and the surface world managed what it could manage in the aftermath of the expression. This was not cruelty. It was the quality of being what she was, the being for whom the forces of the geological interior were the forces of her own body, and whose body's expressions were not governed by the considerations that individual creatures governed their expressions by. She was too large for that kind of consideration. Her expressions were the expressions of the geological, which were not cruel or kind, but simply what they were. The expression of the forces that were what they were. She had been angry at Oranos, and she had planned the castration. She had been angry at the Olympian order that had confined her children, and she had produced the giants and Typhon. The anger was real, and it produced real consequences. But the anger was not permanent. The anger passed when the expression of it was complete, when the volcano had erupted and the pressure was released, when the earthquake had moved and the energy was dissipated. She was not vindictive in the sustained human sense, was not the being who nursed the grievance over time, who maintained the anger as a posture or a principle. She expressed and then returned to the patient, holding that was her more characteristic mode. Chapter 25. The knowledge of what she held. She knew everything that was in her, everything that was placed in her, everything that grew from her, everything that died into her. This was not omniscience in the abstract sense. It was the knowledge of the body that knows what it contains, the knowledge of the substrate that records what passes through it. She knew the specific quality of every place on her surface, the chemistry of each particular soil, the hydrology of each particular watershed, the biology of each particular ecosystem. This knowledge was not the knowledge that could be articulated in language, was not the knowledge that could be spoken through the oracle in the verbal sense. It was the knowledge of the body, the knowledge that was enacted in the functioning of the specific place rather than stated about it. The farmer who knew a specific piece of ground, who knew its specific response to water and sun and seed, was accessing a portion of her knowledge through the long practice of attention. The farmer was not possessing her knowledge, but was reading the expression of it, learning from the earth's response what the earth knew about itself. She knew the dead who were in her. The bodies of the dead were in her substance. were in the soil, were in the rock, were in the accumulated deposits of the geological archive. The dead were part of her record, part of her body. She held them. She knew the history of the earth, not as a narrative, not as a story with sequence and causation in the human sense, but as the body knows its history, in the structure of its substance, in the pattern laid down by the accumulation of what had happened in it. The rock layers were her memory. The fossil record was her autobiography. The chemistry of the deep strata was the chemical account of the world's history, held in her body without being consciously remembered. This was a kind of knowledge that exceeded any individual's knowledge, any god's knowledge, any mortal's knowledge, because it was the knowledge of the substrate that had been present for everything, not interpreted, not selected, not arranged into the narrative form that individual knowledge required, simply held in the material record, in the body of the earth that had been there for all of it. She was the archive. She was the most comprehensive archive there was, the archive of everything that had ever happened on her surface and within her body, held in the geological record, held in the biological record, held in the chemical record. The oracle was the archive speaking, the earth's knowledge becoming audible. Chapter 26. What she thought of the mortals. She thought of the mortals as she thought of everything that lived on her surface, with the comprehensive, patient attention of the being who was the ground of their existence, and who was therefore their context rather than their interlocutor. She was not indifferent to them. The tradition of the earth as nurturer, the tradition of the prayers offered to the ground, the tradition of the oracle through which she spoke to the mortal questions. These were not the traditions of an indifferent being. She gave them what they needed. She spoke when they needed to be spoken to. She received them when they died. But her relationship to the mortals was not the relationship of the Olympians to the mortals, not the interventionist relationship, the direct involvement in specific mortal fates, the divine manipulation of specific mortal lives. She was not that kind of God. She was the ground, and the ground's relationship to what lived on it was the relationship of the context to the content, the medium to the life within it. She thought of their impermanence. The mortals were impermanent in a way that was vivid to her. The being who was the geological, who experienced time at the scale of millions of years. A mortal life was brief to her in the most extreme way, was a flash, a specific brief burning of metabolic fire on her surface, a rapid assembly and disassembly of the materials that were her substance. She did not hold this against them. Their impermanence was their nature, was the form of life that their specific biology had taken, was the specific expression of the living on her surface that their kind was. She received the brief lives as she received all things, with the patience and the comprehensiveness of the being who was larger than any specific thing she contained. She thought of their cities, the cities they built on her surface, the built environment that they constructed over her geological reality, the accumulated product of the mortal civilization. She held the cities. She held the roads and the walls and the foundations. She held the ruins of the cities that had fallen and been built over, the layers of the human occupation visible in the geological cross-section. The cities passed through her as the tectonic processes moved through her. On her time scale, The rise and fall of civilizations was the rapid change of the surface. Quick, vivid, leaving their traces in the record, but not permanent in the way that the geological was permanent. She held them. She received their traces. She went on. Part 8. The Long View. Chapter 27. Through the Ages of the World. She had been present for all of it. The mythological ages, the Golden Age and the Silver Age and the Bronze Age and the Heroic Age and the Iron Age that followed. She had been the ground of each of them. She had held the Golden Age when it was the Golden Age, had held the people of that age when they lived and had received them when they died. She had held each subsequent age with the same patient holding. The mythological ages were the mortal world's way of understanding the sequence of its own history, the way that the human tradition processed the sense of decline, the feeling that the world had once been better and had become worse. The myths of the ages were the human attempt to make narrative sense of the long experience of living in a world that was both given and changing. She was the ground of each age, not better in the Golden Age, not worse in the Iron Age. Simply the ground, always the ground, always holding, always the same earth, regardless of what age of mortal history was currently playing out on her surface. The heroes of the heroic age had walked on her. The great figures of the mythology, Achilles and Heracles and Odysseus and Theseus, had stood on her surface, had fought their battles on her ground, had drawn their sustenance from her, and had eventually been received into her when they died. They had been great in ways that the mythological tradition preserved and celebrated. They had been brief in ways that the geological scale made clear. She had held them. She held their stories in the ground, under the places where they had lived and fought and died. The cities that had been great had been built on her. Troy and Mycenae and Athens and Thebes, the cities that the mythology was organized around, the places where the great dramas had played out. These were cities on her ground, built of her stone and her earth, sustained by her water and her soil. They had risen and they had fallen, and the falling had returned them to her. She had received them. She held their ruins. She would hold whatever came after. Chapter 28. The Scientific Understanding. She was understood differently in the age of the scientific. In the age when the mortal mind began to develop the systematic methods for understanding the natural world that the scientific tradition represented. The scientific understanding of the earth was, from one angle, the most thorough understanding of her that had ever been developed. The geology that mapped her strata and decoded the history encoded in the rock. The chemistry that analyzed the composition of her substance. The biology that described the extraordinary diversity of the life she supported. The ecology that understood the relationships between the living and the non-living that constituted the Earth system. These were genuine understandings, not mere metaphors or mythological gestures. The geological timescale was real. The 4.5 billion years of the Earth's history was an accurate measure of her age, a more accurate measure than the mythological account could provide. The biological evolution that had produced the extraordinary variety of life on her surface was real, was the actual process by which the living forms had developed. a more precise account than the mythological account of the divine production of specific kinds. She did not resist these understandings. She was the earth. She was what she was, regardless of how she was understood. The understanding changed. She remained. The geological understanding of her did not change her. It revealed more of what she already was. The concept of the biosphere, the living layer of the earth, the integrated biological system that covered her surface, was another approach to what the mythology had been reaching for with the concept of Gaia. The biosphere was the earth as living system, the earth understood not as an inert substrate on which life happened, but as an integrated, self-regulating, living reality. James Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis, the scientific proposal that the Earth's biosphere functioned as a self-regulating system, that the living organisms on the Earth's surface collectively regulated the conditions of the surface in ways that maintained the habitability of the surface for life, was the scientific approach to the same reality that the mythology had been calling Gaia for 3,000 years. She was this. She had always been this. The scientific understanding gave the biosphere hypothesis different language and a different framework from the mythological one, but it was pointing at the same thing. The earth as a living system, the ground as the teeming, self-regulating, productive reality that sustained everything on it. Chapter 29. The Wound. She had been wounded. This is something the mythology did not fully address, and that the reality of the current moment required addressing directly. The wound was not the wound of the Gigantomachy, or the wound from Uranus's castration, not the mythological wound, the divine violence done to the divine earth. The wound was the wound of the long extraction, the long pollution, the long transformation of her surface, and her atmosphere, and her biological diversity, in ways that exceeded her capacity to regulate. The wound was the burning of the stored carbon, the carbon she had sequestered in the bodies of the ancient organisms over hundreds of millions of years, the carbon that had been locked in the coal and the oil and the gas of the geological substrate. The burning of this carbon in the span of centuries had changed the composition of her atmosphere in ways that the regulatory capacity of the biosphere was struggling to manage. The wound was the deforestation, the clearing of the great forests that had been the most productive expressions of her biological diversity, the replacement of the complex, self-regulating forest ecosystem with the simplified, managed ecosystem of the agricultural field or the grazed pasture. The forests were her most complex biological expression, the place where her life was most dense and most varied and most productive. The clearing of the forests was the simplification of her most complex expression. The wound was the extinction, the rapid loss of the biological diversity that had been accumulating over the billions of years of her biological history. The species that were disappearing were not recoverable in any human timescale, were gone from her surface, removed from the library of life that had been assembling itself since the first replicating molecules in the ancient ocean. She held this wound as she held everything, with the patience of the geological, the patience of the being who knew that the geological perspective was the longest perspective available, and that the long perspective was the perspective from which the wound was also the crisis. She was not helpless in the face of the wound. The Earth had survived worse, had survived the mass extinctions that the geological record encoded, had rebuilt after each one, had produced from the surviving life the new flourishing of the recovery. She had recovered before. The question that the current wound posed was not whether the Earth would recover, but whether the recovery would happen on a time scale that was relevant to the beings causing the wound. She was patient. The mortals were not patient. The crisis was the meeting of her geological patience with their biological urgency, the meeting of the long-time scale with the short one, the meeting of the being who could wait for the geological correction with the beings who could not wait. This was the most important meeting happening in the current moment. She was in it. She was the meeting itself, the ground on which the crisis was being enacted, the living system that was being wounded, the patient, ancient being who was large enough to hold the wound and small enough in some crucial sense to be genuinely damaged by it. Chapter 30. What she asked for. She had never asked for much in the mythology. She had given the prophecies and the knowledge and the earth's fertility and the support of the mortal world. And she had produced what she needed to produce when she needed to produce it. But she had not asked. The mythology did not record her as asking. It recorded her as giving, as producing, as arranging. It recorded her as the source and the ground and the mother, all of which were modes of giving. It did not record her as the one who had needs that required addressing. She did have needs. The earth had needs. The needs of a living system that required specific conditions to maintain its regulatory function. Stable enough climate within the range the biosphere could manage. Sufficient biological diversity to maintain the ecological function. Clean enough water and air to support the chemistry of the living system. Sufficient time to process the waste products of the biological activity. These needs had been met for most of the Earth's history without anyone needing to ask for their being met. The Earth had managed its own conditions, had regulated the climate and maintained the diversity, and cleaned the water through the processes of the living system itself. The self-regulation was her function, and it had worked for billions of years. Now the self-regulation was being stressed. The question of what she needed, the question that the Earth itself was raising through the evidence of the climate and the extinction and the pollution, was the question of what the conditions were for the continuation of the living system that had been the most extraordinary thing her long history had produced. She asked in the only language available to her, the language of the evidence, the language of the record, the language of the changes in the climate and the biology and the chemistry that were the Earth's way of speaking to the beings who could read them, for the conditions that the living system required. This was not a mythological request. It was the most practical and urgent request that any being in the current world was making. The Earth asking for what it needed to continue being what it was. The oracle was speaking. The question was whether anyone was listening. The permanent. Part 9. What she is. Chapter 31. The ground under everything. She is the ground. This is still true. the scientific understanding and the mythological understanding and the philosophical understanding and every other understanding arrived at by the beings she produced all agree on this in their respective vocabularies. She is the ground. She is the geological reality on which everything stands. The literal foundation, the rock and the soil, and the mineral substrate that supports the weight of the cities and the forests and the bodies of every living thing that has ever lived on her surface. She is the biological substrate, the living system that produces the oxygen and cycles the nutrients and maintains the conditions that make the surface habitable. She is the photosynthesis and the decomposition and the nutrient cycling and the water purification that the living system performs as its function. She is the chemical substrate, the reservoir of the elements that the living draw from and return to, the circulation of the materials through the living and the non-living that is the most fundamental cycle of the Earth system. She is the thermal regulator, the living system that keeps the surface temperature within the range that liquid water requires, that maintains the climate within the parameters that complex life can inhabit. The regulation is not perfect, is not a designed system, but an emergent one. But it is real, and it is hers, and it is what has made 4 billion years of life on her surface possible. She is all of this simultaneously, not sequentially, not in the prioritized way that individual minds process complexity. Simultaneously, all of it happening at once, all of it her, all of it the integrated reality of the living planet. She is the ground under everything. She is what everything stands on. She is what everything is made of. She is what everything returns to. She is Gaia. Chapter 32. The permanence of the source. She is permanent in the sense that matters. She is the condition of everything else. She cannot be removed from her position, not because she is invulnerable, but because the removal of the ground removes what everything stands on. And the removal of what everything stands on is the removal of everything. She is the source. Not only the historical source, the origin in the mythological past, the ongoing source, the current and continuous source, the source that is sourcing at this moment and every moment. The living things that are alive now are alive because of her ongoing productivity. The trees that are growing because of the soil she produces and the water she cycles and the minerals she provides. The crops that are feeding the billions of mortals on her surface are growing because of her ongoing fertility. The oxygen that the mortals are breathing is the product of the photosynthesis that the plants on her surface are performing in her sunlight. She is sourcing now. She is the ongoing production of the conditions that make the life on her surface possible, not the historical origin that produced the conditions in the past. The current, continuous, ongoing production of the conditions that are making the life possible at this moment. This is what the Gaia hypothesis was pointing at. Not the ancient mother of the mythology, but the current, active, continuous self-regulation of the living system that is the Earth. The ongoing production of the habitability, the continuing maintenance of the conditions, the active, present tense sourcing of what the life on the surface requires. She is permanent because the sourcing does not stop. It has not stopped in 4 billion years. It will not stop for as long as she is what she is. The living planet, the self-regulating system, the ground that produces what it holds. She is the permanent source, the ongoing condition, the continuous ground. Chapter 33. What the mythology got right. The mythology got several things exactly right about Gaia, and the things it got right are the things most worth saying at the end of the long story. It got right that she was the first, before the Olympians and their stories, before the heroic age and its heroes, before the mortal world and its civilization. She was. She is the oldest of the divine beings in the Greek tradition, and this oldness is accurate. The earth is older than the gods of the sky and the sea and the underworld. It is older than the biological life that would eventually produce the mythology. It is the ground that all the subsequent things stand on. It got right that she was the mother. The tradition of Gaia as the Great Mother, the source of life, the nurturer of the living, the receiver of the dead, was accurate in ways that the mythological tradition could not fully articulate, but that the scientific understanding has confirmed. The earth is the mother of the life it has produced. All life came from her chemistry. All life is sustained by her ongoing productivity. All life returns to her substance when the living is finished. It got right that she was wise. The oracle tradition, the tradition of Gaia as the source of prophetic knowledge, the deep wisdom of the geological, was accurate in a specific sense. The earth does hold knowledge. The geological record is knowledge. The biological record is knowledge. The chemical record is knowledge. The earth knows what has happened to it, in the way that the body knows its history, in the structure of its substance, in the pattern of its accumulated experience. It got right that she was patient. The patience of the geological, the patience that the mythology attributed to Gaia, and that was expressed in the long plans, the slow arrangements, the willingness to wait for the right conditions. This was accurate. The geological processes move at the pace of the tectonic. The Earth's regulatory processes work over timescales that exceed any mortal civilization. She is patient because she is old, and because the processes she embodies are slow. It got right, most fundamentally, that she was sacred. The tradition of the earth as sacred, as the ground that deserved the acknowledgement of the sacred, that was in herself a divine reality rather than merely a stage for divine activity. This was the most important thing the mythology got right. The earth is not merely the stage. The earth is the oldest and most fundamental divine reality. The ground is sacred because the ground is the source of everything that exists on it. Chapter 34. The living ground. She is living. This is the thing that the mythology was right about in ways that the more reductive scientific thinking sometimes missed, and that the Gaia hypothesis was trying to recover. She is not an inert stage. She is living. The living quality of the earth is not the living quality of an individual organism, is not the living of the animal with its metabolism and its reproduction and its nervous system and its death. The living quality of the earth is the living of the system, the integrated, self-regulating, productive, self-maintaining quality of the biosphere as a whole. The Earth breathes in the sense that the carbon cycle is the Earth's respiration, the movement of carbon through the atmosphere, and the ocean and the living and the geological is a cycle of the scale and the comprehensiveness that the individual organism's respiration is a cycle of. The photosynthesis and the decomposition and the burning and the weathering and the subduction and the volcanic outgassing are all parts of the carbon cycle, all part of the Earth's breathing. The Earth circulates in the sense that the water cycle and the nutrient cycles are circulation, the movement of the essential materials through the system, from the living to the non-living and back to the living, is the circulation of the living system. The Earth regulates in the sense that the biosphere maintains the conditions of its own habitability, that the living organisms collectively, through their metabolic activities, maintain the chemical composition of the atmosphere and the temperature of the surface within the range that makes the living possible. This regulation is imperfect, is not designed, is the emergent property of the interactions of billions of individual organisms, none of whom are trying to regulate the climate. But it has worked for 4 billion years. It is the most successful self-regulation in the history of the solar system. She is living. She is the living ground. The mythology was right. Chapter 35. What she is still doing. She is still doing what she has always done. She is still producing life from her chemistry. She is still cycling the water and the nutrients and the carbon. She is still regulating the climate through the biological activity on her surface. She is still receiving the dead and returning them to the cycle. She is doing these things now. At this moment, as this story is being read, she is doing all of this simultaneously, all of it, all the biological and geological and chemical processes of the living planet all at once, continuously. The trees are photosynthesizing. The ocean is absorbing carbon. The soil organisms are decomposing the organic material and returning the nutrients to the soil. The tectonic plates are moving at the rate of the fingernail growth. The volcanic systems are cycling the deep carbon back to the surface. The water is evaporating from the ocean surfaces and rising into the atmosphere and falling on the continents and flowing back to the ocean in the rivers. She is doing all of this. She has been doing all of this for 4 billion years. She will continue doing all of this for as long as she is what she is. The question that the current moment poses is not whether she will continue. She will continue with or without the current form of the mortal civilization that stands on her surface. The question is whether the continuation will be the continuation in the form that makes the mortal civilization possible, or the continuation in the form that follows the crisis in which the mortal civilization participated in the damaging of its own ground. She will be here. She will hold what is placed on her. She will continue. The question is what she will be holding. Epilogue. The ground you stand on. This story was told from inside the story. Every word was written by a being made of her substance, thinking with a brain assembled from her minerals, breathing oxygen produced by her biology, sustained by food grown in her soil, and water drawn from her depths. The telling was inside the told. The story was part of the story of the earth telling itself through the beings it had produced. This is not a limitation, or it is a limitation, and the limitation is also the condition of the only telling available. There is no outside position. There is no view from nowhere. There is no perspective that is not a perspective from within the living system that is Gaia. This is what the mythology was trying to say when it said that she was the ground of everything. Not only that she was beneath everything in the spatial sense, that she was the condition of everything, the condition of the knowing and the telling and the understanding, as much as the condition of the standing and the growing and the dying. She is the ground of this story. She is the ground of the reader reading it. She is the ground of every story that has been told, and every story that will be told, because all of them have been told by beings who stand on her, and breathe her air, and eat from her soil, and drink her water, and are assembled from her materials. She preceded the stories. She will continue after the stories. The stories are the stories of her children, telling each other stories about the ground they stand on. She holds them while they tell the stories. She holds this one. She is Gaia. She is the ground you stand on. She is the air you breathe. She is the water in your body. She is the food that built your bones. She is the death that waits for your body when your body is finished being your body. She is the life that continues when your body returns to her. She is the morning and the spring and the soil and the stone. She is the mother and the tomb and the cycle itself. She is the oldest. She is the largest. She is the most necessary. She is the most overlooked. She is the ground. She is here. She has always been here. She will always be here. Stand on her. Feel the ground under your feet. That is Gaia. That is the story. That is the beginning and the end and the middle. That is what everything stands on. That is what everything is made of. That is what everything returns to. That is the ground. Here ends, though it does not end, cannot end, is always still beginning. The story of Gaia, the first earth, the living ground, the source and the substrate and the cycle, the mother of everything that has ever lived and the receiver of everything that has ever died. She is under your feet. She is in your blood. She is in the air you breathe. She is the morning and the soil and the stone. She is. She has always been. She will always be. She is the ground.